about co-ops and the benefits of democratizing a business. The second night we got to talk to organic farmers about the benefits of being food producers as opposed to commodity producers. And for those that were here, I think we all fell in love with the water buffalo. Now, on our third night, we're really going to take the gloves off and tackle the subject of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. There's a lot of information and misinformation being thrown around on all sides about it. And unfortunately, one of those sides has the backing of multi-billion-dollar corporations. We're here to talk a little bit about the other side. To do that tonight, we have Tarini Chopra. She's from the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, and Ann Slater. She's an organic farmer, and I believe it's the Vice President of Policy for the National Farm Union. So, between the speakers, we will have an intermission. We have some boost with information. You'll be happy to know that the Aeolian Hall bar does serve Mill Street organic beer. And we also will have some performances from one of our members, Margot. She is a social justice folk singer. I think you'll all really enjoy that. So I want to just jump right into it tonight, and I want to welcome Tarini Chopra to the stage from the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. Come on up.
Adjust this a foot or two. Little people make. Is that good? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Chris, and thanks also to all the London Food Co-op people who organized this, what I've heard has been a really super series, and for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of it. So, as some of you may know, the first GM crop was introduced in Canada in 1995. So that puts us at 20 years that we've had GM crops in Canada, in our environment, in our food, in our grocery stores. And that seems like a pretty good chunk of time to have really figured out some of the impacts and some of the risks that we're talking about. But as it happens, there's a lot of questions that we still don't know nearly enough about, and as Chris said, a lot of mixed, conflicting messages. So what I'm going to do today is spend a little bit of time just sort of capping where we are after these 20 years, and then a little bit more time thinking about where we're headed. And then I'll hand over to Anne, who will look at some other aspects of the topic. Much of the information I'm going to share today is part of a project that we've just launched called GMO Inquiry 2015. And it's a project that's being organized by CBAN, so the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, the group that I work with. And what we're really trying to do in this project over the course of this year is to fill in some of those gaps in the information that we have about GMOs and their risks and their impacts. So over the course of the year, we're going to be doing research and other ways of having folks get involved, and the research is going to be framed on these 6 questions that are up behind me, and that for those of you who grabbed the little postcards, they're on there too. I'm only going to touch on the first 3 of them today, just for the sake of time, and we'll cover some topics that'll sort of touch on a couple of the others. But over the course of the next few months, every few weeks or months, we're going to put out a new piece of research, a report that answers each one of those questions. And so I'd love to invite all of you to visit, I do have the website up there, to visit that website, to sign up if you'd like to follow along as we do this research, to get our research bulletins as we put them out, but also to actually help us shape that inquiry or this investigation by telling us what it is that you think is most important to you for us to do research on. And there's a little spot on the website where you can submit your questions for us to sort of get a sense of what you'd like us to look at the most. So that's that for the project. I'll come back to that at the end. But just to get started, that first question, so where in the world are GM crops? And the other piece of that question is, what food foods are GM. Where in the world are they? Where are they ending up? Where in our food system do they end up? So to get into this a little bit, I'm going to do a bit of an exercise, and I'm going to step out of the light and holler so I can see your hands, because I can't see them now. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so with a quick show of hands, how many of you feel like you have a good sense of what foods are GM and aren't GM? Sorry, okay, yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so if you were all going to go to the grocery store tomorrow, say you were looking for orange juice, do you think it may be GM? Could it be GM? Yeah, couple hands. What about if you were going to buy a bag of flour for baking? Could that be GM? Yeah, lots of hands. What about a head of lettuce? Yeah. Organic tortilla chips?
Is it certified?
Organic tortilla chips. What about vegetable oil? Yeah. Okay, so some of you might be a little bit surprised, given those hands, to know that actually there's really only 4 main GM crops that are being grown anywhere in the world. And those are soy, corn, canola, and cotton. So all those of you who very enthusiastically put your hands up quickly with the vegetable oil, yes, there's a good chance that vegetable oil would have one of those ingredients in it. But that head of lettuce, or really most of your fresh fruits and vegetables, they will not be GM because there aren't any commercialized GM varieties of those fresh fruits and vegetables. So together, soy, corn, canola, and cotton account for over 99%, so 99 point something percent, of all the GM acres in the world. Most of those 4 crops are engineered with either one or both of 2 traits. And those 2 traits are herbicide tolerance and insect resistance. So herbicide tolerance is when a crop is engineered to basically be able to withstand, to survive an application of a herbicide, a particular herbicide. So that means you can apply the herbicide in your field, the weeds will die, and the crop won't. Insect resistance is when a crop is engineered to produce a toxin in itself. That toxin comes from a bacteria that is poisonous, that kills certain groups of insects. And those plants are usually called Bt plants because the bacteria that gene comes from is the Bt bacteria. So those are really the 2 main traits. So when we hear about all this wide range of GM crops with a wide range of traits, we hear about traits that have higher yield or that help plants adapt to particular environmental conditions, such as drought, or you hear about plants that are nutritionally enhanced. We don't actually have any of those traits in commercialized GM crops anywhere in the world at the moment. So in Canada, we have 3 out of those 4, so corn, soy, and canola. And we also have a smaller amount of sugar beet. So here's where some of the other little crops come in. Other than those 4 major crops, there are a few other GM crops in the world. There's a little bit of sweet corn, there's a little bit of papaya and squash, as you can see on the chart behind me. Are you able to read that chart? That looks good. Well, there's papaya and squash on there. Of course, there can be cottonseed oil in some things. But all of those other crops, all of those smaller crops together, add up for less than 1% of the global GM acres. So it's really a very, very tiny percentage in Canada and also in the rest of the world. So when you go to the grocery store and you're wondering how to just know which foods have GM and not, so that you can make your decision based on whether you want to actually buy something with GM ingredients, there is no labeling, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the few ways that you can know is, well, most produce, so apart from those couple of things, almost all produce, so fruits and vegetables, are not going to be GM. Most whole foods are not GM. And for processed foods, some foods of course come with labels, right? Using non-GM ingredients or have been certified to be non-GM. But even those that haven't, if the ingredients list doesn't include something that is made from these 4 crops, then it cannot be GM. There can't be any GM ingredients in it. So that's sort of a starting point. Now the next question, of course, is, well, how much of each of these crops is grown in Canada, right? Like that seems like fairly basic information that we should know. But unfortunately, we don't. And the reason we don't know it, we have estimates. We have estimates that there's, about 80% of our corn is GM in the country, about 95% of our canola is GM. But those estimates are estimates, and the reason we don't have standardized information about those 4 crops is because we do not require, the government doesn't monitor and track where GM foods are in the country and how much of them there is. So that's kind of, that explains a little piece of what these 20 years have looked like. That also makes it a little bit hard to know exactly what all the impacts are, right? Because if we don't know exactly where GM crops are in the field, it's hard to know what impacts they're having on the environment, on the fields around them. But we do, of course, from these 20 years of experience, have some pretty good sense of some of the main impacts that we've seen. So I won't talk about all. The environment is a big topic, of course, but and Anne is going to touch on some of these as well. But pesticide use is obviously a really major one, right? And we all hear about this. So I think it's worth thinking about what has the impact of GM crops been on pesticide use in these 20 years, both for herbicide-tolerant crops as well as for insect-resistant or BT crops. So starting with the herbicide-tolerant crops. So those, just as a reminder, are the ones that can tolerate a certain, the application of a certain kind of herbicide. So over the past 20 years, when we look at the patterns in areas that have been growing a lot of herbicide-tolerant crops, we've seen that herbicide use has climbed as the area under herbicide-tolerant crops has climbed. Some of you might have heard of a very well-known study by Chuck Benbrook. He looked at 16 years of GM crops, herbicide-tolerant crops in the US, and he found that herbicide use went up by 527 million pounds in that 16-year period. That's pretty significant. And it's not just in the US. So in Argentina, for example, in 1995, I believe there was 8 million pounds of glyphosate. That's the main herbicide that's used in herbicide-tolerant crops. That were used, 8 million pounds. By 2013, that number had risen up to 200 million pounds. And this, just to clarify, someone was asking me about this before, glyphosate-tolerant crops are what we often refer to or hear of as Roundup-ready crops, because Roundup is the glyphosate herbicide, Monsanto's glyphosate herbicide that's very commonly used. So that's what we're talking about. And of course, when you have constant and repetitive applications of the same herbicide and you have weeds in the fields being exposed to that same herbicide, then those weeds become tolerant to that chemical. So we've started having herbicide-tolerant weeds in the fields. And this is, of course, it's a problem from an environmental point of view, but it's also a major problem for farmers. And Anne will get into this more, so I'll skim over it a little bit. But just to say that we now have 28 herbicide-tolerant or glyphosate-tolerant weeds, and 5 of them are here, can be found in Canada as well. Another 14 of them can be found in the US. And that little chart just shows you how those glyphosate-tolerant crops have emerged over the past 20 years, so from 1995 onwards. So that's a really major problem. In parallel to that, a similar sort of pattern has been happening with BT crops. So BT crops are less common overall around the world, but in some areas they're being grown quite a bit. So for example, in India, BT cotton is grown in a very widespread way through the cotton growing belt. It's largely grown by smaller scale farmers on smaller scale plots. So, and often on marginal soils. What's been happening with BT crops is that originally, when they were introduced to the fields, the insects that they are supposed to target were wiped out. But very soon, again, because of repeated exposure, those insects also became tolerant to the actual toxin that the crop is producing, so to the BT plants themselves. So they came back. But in that meantime, while they weren't so much pressure from that particular pest, it's called a bollworm, other insects came in, because that's what happens in nature, right? When there's a void, something comes in to fill it. So all of a sudden, farmers are dealing with quite high pest pressure, and they've got these BT cotton crops that aren't doing very well, and that they're having to put extra pesticide on, even though the plant is actually producing the pesticide. And that was the promise of BT crops. The main promise of BT crops was that it would reduce the amount of pesticides farmers had to put in the fields. So that doesn't seem to be playing out over a longer term period. So in India, for example, over the past 12 years, which is how long BT cotton has been cultivated in India, none of the 4 main cotton growing states have actually seen a decrease in pesticide use. None of the 4. And in the meantime, of course, GM seed is expensive, right? It's significantly more expensive than conventional seed or than traditional seed. And so these farmers are putting out, again, very small scale farmers with not a lot of capital, high stakes, are putting out a larger amount of money at the beginning of the season. And then if something doesn't work, if there's a crop failure, or if they have to add in more money by buying pesticides, or if the insect pressure is too big, then the stakes for those farmers and what they're losing is really also very high. And of course, the environment is taking a higher sort of load at the same time. So those are sort of some of the environmental impacts. And of course, it's not all. Like I said, there's many other questions, right? So for example, the BT crops themselves produce a toxin. What is the effect of that toxin on other biodiversity, on non-target organisms? What is the impact of both herbicide-tolerant and insect-resistant crops on water quality, on soil, right? We have some bits and pieces of answers, but we're definitely still don't have quite enough information about these answers. And again, Anne will get into some more of this in a little bit. But of course, environmental questions are then very closely related to questions of whether GM crops are better for consumers, right? Better for eaters. And there's a couple of things here that I think are particularly important. So again, someone was asking me about this before the talk, but as many of you might know, there is no labeling, no mandatory labeling of GM crops in Canada. We don't require that happens. And we know that people want that. We know that Canadians want that because over the past 20 years and over a number of different polls, over 80% of consumers have said that they want products to be labeled with whether they have GM ingredients or not. And that's of course closely related to the fact that consumers aren't really officially invited to be in any sort of way part of the approval process, right? Our approval process for new GMO products doesn't include any public consultation. So those things are closely related because what consumers want to see, what they want to eat, and how they want to be told about what they want to eat isn't actually really being considered in the regulatory process. And then, of course, there's the related question of safety, right? Of course, that's very important to all of us. We want to know what we're eating, and we want to know what effect it's going to have on us. But one of the big problems with that is that because we don't track where our GM food goes, so because we don't have products labeled, and then after that, there's no post-market surveillance, right? So when we go to the store and we buy something and we take it home and we eat it, there's no tracking in the long term of what effects it might be having. So we don't know conclusively what health impacts GM foods may have, but if they are having any, we wouldn't know, right? Because we're not tracking where those foods go. So it's very hard to connect any impacts up with the foods that are being consumed. So that's a really important sort of pattern that we need to change. And one way to change it, and what a lot of scientists who are thinking about these issues are calling for, is more of a precautionary principle. So the idea basically is that until we don't have scientific consensus, conclusive evidence that GM crops are safe for people, then we shouldn't be putting them in the stores. We shouldn't be putting them even into our environment. But that's not the case at the moment. And that's, I think, partly why this 20-year period is an important time to stop and sort of evaluate where we're at and where we're headed. And that's partly because we still have new GM crops that are coming up for approval to the government. And the government is still introducing new GM crops into our environment and into our food system. So when we think about, okay, well, what's to come? You know, looking ahead, what do things look like? I think in some ways, if we look back at the past few years, and we see what GM foods and crops have been kept off the market, I think the answer to that question is a little bit, it's up to us. Because consumer and farmer pressure has kept GM crops, a number of GM foods and crops, off the market in the past few years. And some of you may remember GM alfalfa from the past couple of years. There was a lot of action across the country from farmers, from eaters, to really keep this crop off because the impacts for organic farmers are quite devastating. And again, I won't talk about this because I might touch on it. We can come back to it in questions otherwise. But if it hadn't been for that pressure from organizations, from individuals, we would have had Roundup Ready alfalfa in our fields by now. Organic farmers would have been taking the brunt of what that implies. And we would have had yet one more herbicide-tolerant crop in our environment. But that hasn't happened, and there's other examples. So now we have to continue to channel that energy to keep those foods off, and also to think about the new GM crops that could be introduced. And the most recent one, the most urgent one in a way, because it might be approved any day, is the GM apple. So some of you might have heard about this. It's been in the news a little bit over the past few days. But the background to this basically is that there's a small company in BC called Okanagan Specialty Fruit that has developed a genetically modified apple that doesn't brown when you cut it. So for up to 15 to 18 days, that's what the company says, this apple won't brown. The company had asked both the USDA and Canada, Health Canada, for approval to put this apple on the market. And just a few days ago, last week, the USDA said that it has approved it, but Health Canada has not yet approved it. Right? So this is the moment that all of us have to sort of say what we think about this crop entering our food system, and making sure that if we don't want it to be in our food system, we voice that and make sure it happens. And there's a number of ways to do this. And also, I should say, we know that Canadians don't want this, and neither do fruit growers. The BC Fruit Growers Association has said that they don't want the GM apple, that they're very worried about the implications of the apple for other apple growers who are not growing GM, and of course, especially for organic apple growers. And consumers have also said across the country, so a poll that was done, I think 2 or 3 years ago, found that 69% of people said that they don't want the GM apple on the market. So what can we do? Well, there's a number of things. The first, of course, is it's Health Canada's decision. So the way the process works now, Health Canada, it's basically in Health Canada's power to say yes or no to this GM food. So the first thing we can do is to write to Health Canada, to write to the Minister of Health. CBAN has a letter on our website if you want a bit of a starting point. You can also, of course, write your own. It gets CC'd to a whole bunch of other ministers. The other thing is to write to the heads of big grocery chains. And we know that these grocery chains are listening because people who have written all of us are finding that they're very concerned about what consumers really think about this crop, about this food, and how they're going to react if it's put on the market. And a number of big companies, McDonald's included, Gerber Foods, has already said that they will not use the GM apple. So this is the moment where we can write to other companies, tell them about the apple, tell them about how we feel, and see that it doesn't get put on there. And then that also applies at the more local level. So talking to managers at our local grocery stores, telling them what we think. Many of them don't know about the GM apple because it's not covered all that widely. But telling them that we don't want the GM apple in our shelves, that's going to really make a difference. And one step further, that's what our adopter retailer refers to, is if local food stores feel it seems like they're open to the idea, then we have a pledge that they can sign to say that they will not sell the GM apple in their stores. And if they do, they get a cool little window cling with that apple logo on it that they can put on the front. And that, it seems like that's already having a bit of a domino effect because stores are telling other stores, consumers see it in front of one store, so they talk to members of the other stores, and that kind of thing. And that's an important measure to do at the moment because if this apple doesn't have a market, then there's no reason to have it out there, right? 77 retailers have already signed this pledge, and I'm sure many of you will be delighted to know that the London Food Co-op is one of them. Thank you. And I guess one of the things that, when we were talking earlier today about the fact that the London Food Co-op's fruit and vegetables are all organic, that made me realize that that's actually another really great guarantee, right, that they are giving you, because that is one way that you know there is no GM food. So organic farmers are not allowed to use GM seed or GM crops. Organic certification doesn't permit that. And organic foods in your grocery stores don't have any GM ingredients in them. So when we choose to support those businesses that are offering us that food, but also the farmers like the folks who came out to talk to you, I guess a couple weeks ago, farmers like Anne, who are about to talk to you, we're choosing to support farmers who are breaking out of the patterns of pesticide use that I talked about earlier, and of course, actively we're choosing to support farmers who are keeping GM foods out of our food and farming. And that's a really important piece of what we can do as we look ahead. I'll wrap up soon, but again, I'll just end by inviting you all again to check out our website and more about the project. And I think Anne is going to cover some of the other pieces, so if there was anything I said that was particularly unclear, I can take a couple of questions now, but otherwise maybe after we're both done, we can hop back up and take questions together. So if anyone had anything that they felt like asking right now. Yeah.
Why isn't the Ministry of Health helping us out here? Because this is obviously going to hurt the health of everybody.
It's a good question. I don't have a whole lot of answers to. I mean, that's definitely, it is part, there's several pieces of our regulation system, the way it's set up, that is not paying nearly enough attention to what consumers and farmers' concerns are. And that's a problem, right? Not just the health piece, but also all the other pieces. But there's no space to actually have those concerns officially thought about or considered before a new crop is approved. And I think Anne's going to talk about regulation, so that'll fill in some of those gaps too. But yes, there is a missing piece there as far as what a responsible regulatory system would look like. Absolutely. Was there another question just behind?
Can you give us a little bit of information on CPAN itself?
Yeah. Can I step out of the mic? Can you all hear me? Or should I? Sorry. So CBAN is the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. We are a network of different organizations, so environmental organizations, farm groups, consumer groups, that are basically working to monitor and do research on GM foods, the impact of GM foods in the environment, this kind of project, as I mentioned. And we really are more of a network than an organization. That's how we work. So we use sort of the experience that all of those different groups have in their own sectors to come together to sort of monitor this common issue. Was that?
That helps.
Yeah. And I can tell you more about like our list of members and all of that. We have it all on our website too, but there's 17 members, so I won't list them all right now. Okay, well, maybe I'll hand over to Anne for now, and then I'll come back when she's done as well. We can.
Thank you very much, Trini, for that information. Those apples sound absolutely disgusting. We have some time, so we're actually going to bring up Margot on stage to play a song for us, and then we're going to take an intermission. We have some food out in the front, and we have some other people here today. The London Library has some information, as does EVAC, the Old East Village Arts Co-op, and the London Resource Centre. So if Margot is available, come on up.
Good evening. Glad lots of people made it out on the coldest night of the year, almost. Well, that was last night, I think. So, this first song I want to dedicate to Vananda Shiva. Some of you probably know who that is. She's the vanguard in India and other places of gaining back the land from these chemical companies and from these GMO people. The farmers, thousands and thousands of farmers became desperate and actually committed suicide because they got bullied into buying seeds, and then all the support system that goes along with that. And then if their crops failed, they wouldn't have enough money to pay back the companies and so on. A lot of you know about this. And it also brings to mind that when I was young on the farm, we saved our own seeds as well, as much as possible. So this song is called Don't Tell Us What to Grow. And I think that, yeah, we can put the words of the chorus up on the screen, if you don't mind, Chris. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. We're saving our own seeds, that's what we'll sow. Your game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. Let's try that together. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. We're saving our own seeds, and that's what we'll sow. Your game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. I want to eat food that's organic. And why would this make you panic? We should have a say about feeding ourselves. So get those GMOs off of the shelves. Well, have you heard that no means no? Take this message to the PMO. Yesterday's farmers got caught in your trap. Today and tomorrow's farmers aren't taking your crap. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. You're saving our own seeds, and that's what we'll sow. Your game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. I saw you snooping around our gardens. And who has made you produce warden? Genetic testing may increase your wealth. How about testing what it does to our health? I want no part of your monoculture. I see you're circling like vultures. You're after our land, you're after our seed. There's so many ways to interpret your greed. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. We're saving our own seeds, and that's what we'll sow. Your game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. Here's a subject you would rather avoid. Using neonicotinoids. Our governments let you do as you please, but you'll be eating less once you've killed off all the bees. I just want to grow my own little salad. You're trying to make this invalid. Who gave you the right to poison the soil? No wonder I'm singing this ballad. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. We're saving our own seeds, and that's what we sow. Yes, the game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. One more. Don't tell us what to eat, don't tell us what to grow. We're saving our own seeds, and that's what we'll sow. Your game of Monopoly leaves little choice. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go. If you don't tell us what to grow, we won't tell you where to go.
Woo!
Thank you so much.
Intermission, stretch your legs.
Questions at the beginning of the